I'd say the best thing about being a multiplayer designer at the studio, or just being a designer at the studio in general, is the fact that you get to own your ideas.
My name is Robert Cogburn, lead game designer.
I'm a game designer at Naughty Dog, multiplayer specifically.
I'm a multiplayer designer.
I'm a lead multiplayer designer here at Naughty Dog.
Designers at Naughty Dog act as both a game designer, those who come up with the ideas and implement them, and the producer, the people who ensure that those ideas come to fruition in time and at a high quality bar.
A multiplayer designer does a lot of things. We wear a lot of hats. We script systems, we design systems, we create layouts.
We're really given a lot of autonomy to come up with the design for what multiplayer should be. And it's really up to the multiplayer team to define that and then to execute on that. But we have a huge support structure of the entire company at our disposal. So we use the same artists, same animators, same sound designers.
What we don't want is multiplayer to feel like a mode. We want it to be almost its own game, its own experience. It might start with an idea of a world or idea of a mechanic, or even more recently, a certain feeling that we're after, and then we will explore, okay, what kind of world can evoke that feeling? What kind of mechanics can evoke that feeling? What kind of psychological situations can we put multiple people in that speak back to the theme that we're after?
The leads don't really dictate how and what the game should be. It's very much a collaborative effort here.
We'll brainstorm an idea and we all go off and work on our different disciplines. And when we come together, you're seeing just amazing stuff, better than you could ever imagine, as it coalesces into this something that's truly greater than the sum of its parts.
All right, so as more news developed about the Last of Us factions supposedly being excluded from The Last of Us Part 2 and Naughty Dog making their new official statement, I just want to sort of talk about some of the gross reaction in the community and give my 2 cents. First and foremost, in the last video, I felt like I was being very diplomatic about my approach. I said I could see both sides. I could see one side who really doesn't care about multiplayer offerings, and I can also see the other side where it's like you're taking away a key component of the game that was in the original, and you would be regressing backwards by leaving that component out of the game entirely, or leaving it out and not capitalizing on the idea of expanding The Last of Us Factions Part 2. Now, I kind of agree a little bit more with the multiplayer side. I kind of agree because the single player side, they are starting to say things where they don't know what the fuck they're talking about, and we're going to get right into that with a few key points before addressing Naughty Dog's official statement. First and foremost, I do agree with the single player people that yes, there's not a soul that's going to boycott this game all because there's multiplayer in it. The multiplayer people that are saying that, you are actually frauding. You're going to still pick up this game regardless. You can sign as many petitions as you want. You can sign as many treaties as you want. You're still picking up this experience to see if Naughty Dog lived up to the hype or not. And just because the multiplayer is excluded doesn't mean you aren't buying the game. I don't take people seriously anyway who use the word boycott in 2019 unless you're James Rolfe. Moving on. They also said that I never care for multiplayer and Naughty Dog is all about single player. Now, if that were true, they wouldn't have expanded multiplayer ventures with Uncharted 3 Drake's Deception. There is 12 modes in Uncharted 3 Drake's Deception. They obviously did care about their multiplayer community. Otherwise, they wouldn't have another tacked on multiplayer for Uncharted 3 Drake's Deception. They wouldn't have multiplayer for The Last of Us. They do have a foundation of being known for their single player ventures. However, they have also dabbled in cooperative play and multiplayer for the longest time now, and they have thriving communities because of it. Look at Crash Team Racing. You could play that with like multiple people, right? Jack X. You could also play that with multiple people, right? They had a foundation of experimentations that grew as they tested more cooperative play alongside their single player ventures. And that cannot be denied with any of the IPs they established. Look at how the fruits of Naughty Dog's labor paid off for another company when they were experimenting with the components of Crash Team Racing. Now we have Crash Team Racing Nitro Fuel, and that paid off for Activision in the end, and I don't want to hear this being debated otherwise. They decided to basically experiment with this, do the best they can with it, see if the community likes it. And so far, from what I see, outside of the obvious criticism of Uncharted 3 Drake's Deception having kickbacks and mysticals and all that stuff, I think it was Uncharted 4 that had the mysticals. I totally forget, but you see what I'm saying. You see my point is that people did care about this multiplayer, that Naughty Dog did care about this multiplayer to expand upon it. That is not objective thinking to say that I didn't care for the multiplayer, I didn't have much love for the multiplayer. There are people that did. So what if you didn't care about it? Someone could also not care about your individual opinion as well and throw it in the trash. There is still people logging into The Last of Us Remastered multiplayer to this day, still playing The Last of Us factions to this day. That game has been out since what, 2014, and you can still find a match. Usually multiplayer games die off, as you guys claim that there's multiplayer games that die off like occasionally and The Last of Us factions really didn't matter. You still wouldn't find a fucking match if it didn't matter. And what pisses me off the most about what these people are saying is they try to compare apples and oranges. They try to say, well, you guys really didn't complain about this issue for the Tomb Raider reboot when that had multiplayer, and eventually when they moved on to Rise of the Tomb Raider, they excluded the multiplayer and no one really gave a fuck. Okay, who fucking even cared about Tomb Raider's multiplayer? It was laggy, it was buggy. I played it. I did not like that multiplayer at all. It's not even comparable. It's apples and oranges. Factions was actually good compared to Tomb Raider's multiplayer. That was ass. You can't fucking compare something that people didn't care about to begin with versus a established community that people played these games in, they enjoyed these games in, they loved fucking factions in, and they actually cared about that component. So for Naughty Dog to say, hey, we're taking it out, of course it's going to warrant that blowback. Of course it's going to warrant that criticism from other users saying that they love factions and they would love to see it expanded upon. If you're saying that people are crying over the subject and they shouldn't improve The Last of Us factions, you are just as much of a moron. You are just as much of an idiot as the individuals who are claiming that they will boycott this game if it does not have multiplayer without giving the single player a fair shake. Look, I'm going to tell this to you straight. Nobody is standing the idea of removing content that increases the longevity of the game, especially if that content is good. Once again, if you don't see both sides of the equation, that sometimes a good multiplayer mode and a good single player mode can extend the longevity of a game and make it actually worthwhile. And if The Last of Us shipped with multiplayer in mind and single player, you can't make the argument of saying that, well, The Last of Us is a single player only driven game in the first place. I didn't play the multiplayer, so it doesn't matter to me. The Last of Us clearly shipped with single player and multiplayer in mind, bar none. If you take one thing out, as far as the sequel goes, then that means that that sequel better be good. It better be warranted with the amount of playtime and replayability that you can receive to compensate taking out the multiplayer. And that's what I said yesterday. This single player better be completely fantastic with every step of the way. It better have some very damn good pacing. It better have some very damn good storytelling and gameplay in mind once it ships, and it better be almost like 20 to 30 hours with a lot of replay value going for it. That's the only way it's justifiable, is if they make that single player experience completely fantastic, and that's what they're aiming for. And I'm not taking that away from Naughty Dog. If they live up to their statements, then cool, everything's fine. It means they accomplished their goal. However, once you take out a component that's good, you need to reevaluate it, because it should be improved, just like the single player gameplay is going to be improved for this entry. What else did people say about this Last of Us shit? Oh yeah, something that slightly irked me. Oh, I can finally get my platinum now in The Last of Us Part 2 because it won't have multiplayer grinds. What? When are you nibbas going to actually play those single player games with extremely hard grinds and get the platinum for them? You casual motherfuckers are talking out of your ass. When are you going to get the platinum for Vanquish? When are you going to get the platinum for Ninja Gaiden 2? Maybe even DMC 5? Sit the fuck down. You're going to play that fucking game one time and move on to the next game. Facts. When did these casual gamers tell me a story motherfuckers care about trophies anyway? If the single player has some difficult, hard to get trophy for The Last of Us Part 2, you're not going to go for it. You're not going to go for that grind. These casual people, they give up rather easily. There were people complaining about the S+ requirement for Resident Evil Remake 2 and having to save like only 3 times. They said, oh, I hope Capcom reduces that number. Oh, I hope Capcom is more lenient over the time that you have to get for a S+ requirement rank for Resident Evil 2 Remake. And then they eventually had it where you could buy the infinite weapons anyway. So what the fuck, right? You guys aren't gonna care. You guys don't give a fuck about trophies. You're just saying that shit just to say it. I swear, I guarantee that if The Last of Us Part 2 has hard single player trophies, then this entire argument of yay, I can finally get my platinum now will be fucking null and void. The trophy they're talking about in particular is where you had to play like 12 weeks of being part of the Fireflies and part of the Hunters as a faction, along with getting various multiplayer trophies. Now, I will admit, those trophies aren't really the greatest. If your entire like encampment dies due to the system where you have to get parts to make your camp survive, and it was kind of bullshit when the 100% population risk turned up, that could wipe out all your progress if you fail getting all the requirements you needed to make your camp live. However, you can't sit there and pretend that single player games don't have excruciatingly annoying trophies as well. It works on both sides of the spectrum. Sometimes it happens. Just in the case of multiplayer, if the servers go down, then you're fucked. You're never getting that platinum. However, for the single player, there are platinums that people will not get because they will not play on higher difficulties because they are fucking casual. The last point these people tried to make was that does everything need a multiplayer component to it or a cooperative or competitive element? No, it doesn't. If the game is originally intended to ship as a single player game like Silent Hill 2, or you got great games like Grandia 2, then it doesn't need a multiplayer component. They can stand on the merits of gameplay alone. However, The Last of Us did not ship as a single player only game. Do you understand that? It did not ship as a single player only game, and that component that they took out added replay value that was actually good. I can see if The Last of Us 1 was single player only and people decided to flip the script and say, hey, what about the multiplayer? Do you guys have multiplayer? No, it originally didn't have multiplayer, so it doesn't make sense to make that argument, but it did release with 2 great components that many people adored, so I don't see what the problem is. That's like saying because RE4 did mercs, and the next game they decided to take out mercs, and mercs was a pretty decent mode. It was a pretty good mode to pass the time with replay value, and they decided to make RE5, and they decided to say we're taking out mercs because we can't expand upon it, or whatever the excuse is, whether they're working on the campaign more, etc. You're telling me that they couldn't have expanded upon mercs since RE5 introduced the idea of co-op? Are you out of your minds? There's always room for improvement. It's time to stop acting like there can't be anything done in this situation to improve a game or its components if people liked it. Understand both sides. That's all I'm saying. Stop fucking damage controlling over features being removed in video games. That's some fucking white knight bullshit. That's some fucking Sony cocksucking bullshit. That's some fucking casual single player fans who never gave the fucking multiplayer any chance, who probably will get swept by me in multiplayer matches. Those are the people that do not care about multiplayer, but I definitely do. I definitely think that factions could have been improved upon, and And if you say otherwise, then you are a condescending, subjective jackass. I mean, look at both sides. Both games could have been improved, the single player and the multiplayer. And for this statement, for this upcoming statement right now, I do wish that Naughty Dog would have been more transparent over saying, hey, we're gonna exclude a component from our game that had a community, that had a following, that had a backing, that people still play to this day. We're gonna exclude that for the sequel, but we're not gonna tell you guys right now that we're working on Last of Us Factions Part 2, and we're going to introduce that later as a standalone game that you could probably buy for like cheap. We're not gonna do that at all. We're instead going to give you the bad news before we give you the silver lining, the possible hope in the future that we might do a faction standalone game. They should have been transparent and told us that from the beginning. Otherwise, there would be no drama. There would be no miscommunication. Everything would be perfect. I would be like, okay, they want to focus more on The Last of Us Part 2 single player, and then maybe they will offer a standalone Last of Us component. So if people want to play more Last of Us, they have double the opportunity now. Say that from the beginning. Be clear. Be transparent. Say what you're going to say from the beginning, because that's what I mostly gleaned from that statement. It seemed like Naughty Dog said that the silver lining is that we are basically working on something super ambitious for The Last of Us Part 2, and that is the single player. The single player is really momentous. It is really huge. It is gaining a lot of traction. We need all hands on deck. Rockstar Games, they like to do this too, where they get all studios on deck for one game. I can completely understand and see that. Sometimes a project is way too big and you can't do it by yourself. You can't, it's impossible. You cannot do it on your own without a bigger team, a bigger studio. So they mentioned that Factions also, in their statement, it also was a project that got way too big and ambitious, and they needed to flesh this out. I assume this goes hand in hand with the new animations, the new mechanics introduced in The Last of Us Part 2, where Ellie can now jump and climb. It's really nothing particularly new to the stealth action genre, but it is new to The Last of Us Part 2. Because the first game didn't have those features at all. Ellie is very nimble in The Last of Us Part 2. So I assume they need to play test. They need to hire these people out there who could test these components, and Naughty Dog said they are working on like getting those people involved to work on their online ventures for a future standalone game. Will it be charged? Absolutely. You know how companies work. They are going to charge for the standalone release of Factions if they decide to make it. So worst case scenario is that this isn't Factions, this is a completely new game, and the Twitter wars will be rising because people will be like, well, Naughty Dog lied to us in the first place. They like to kiss you before they fuck you. I think that the best outcome is that this is a standalone game and it is filled to the brim with possible potential and a lot of ambitious takes from the original single player campaign. They took all of those components and they meshed them into the online experience where everything is fully balanced out. All these modes were expanded upon. They have hunters versus clickers, which is what I wanted from the beginning, fighting against the monsters in a co-op venture. And it has like minimal micros that doesn't really break the game, or none at all, because no one wants any DLC guns. That would be the most ideal world, but everything is not ideal. I know they're going to charge for this, and I know they're probably going to have microtransactions if it is Factions. It's kind of vague, but at least they put out a statement. They just should have clarified this earlier. Otherwise, all the drama would have been avoided. Just say that you had a standalone Factions in the works and it was way too ambitious as well, and you want to do playtesting. What's the fucking problem with releasing a statement like that first? It should have been like that first, and it shouldn't have been like that during Outbreak Day, where they were saying they were taking it out entirely at the behest of the fans who actually enjoyed that multiplayer experience overall, and they would have loved to see it again in The Last of Us Part 2. Just to clarify, there won't be any multiplayer offerings in The Last of Us Part 2, solely focused on single player. I can understand that, and Factions is possibly coming as a standalone release or maybe as DLC, because, you know, that part is vague. It could always come as DLC or a standalone release. We never know, but whatever happens in the future, I just want a good game in the process. That's all I want. Two good components that mesh well with each other because it was in the original game. Anyway, this is Renegade Operative signing off. Hopefully you guys really enjoyed this video. Once again, I just wanted to talk about Naughty Dog's recent statement on The Last of Us Part 2 Factions. I wanted to give my 2 cents, and I wanted to simply just talk about the stuff that's been going on in the community. I wish I made this video first over the one where I tried to be diplomatic. I can see that I can disagree with other people's points on a subject matter, even if they have some good points involved. I'm not saying that the single player people didn't have any good points. Like I said, those saying that they will boycott The Last of Us Part 2 single player because they didn't get multiplayer, those people are retarded. Same with those who made the claim that multiplayer is needed in all games. Those people are also dumb because it's not true. It's not true that it's needed in all games. If there was a multiplayer component that was bad, and it was in a previous game, or it was shoehorned in and people really didn't give a fuck about it, then I'm not going to give a fuck about it, and you could take it out as much as you want. But if it was good, if it had a community, it should be looked at, it should be reevaluated. Those features should not be ignored. Like I said, always room for improvement. Just get that point. Just understand both sides. That's all I'm saying. Anyway, this is Renegade Operative signing off. This has been a crazy venture. I have to talk about the recent news of Spider-Man coming back into the MCU and being pitted up against Batman with their third entry. I think that movie is coming out sometime in July, so it's going to be a crazy box office clash with the Batman and Spider-Man in 2021 approaching near each other. So I'll talk about that later. Once again, hopefully you enjoyed this discussion. Rant, I guess, is more of a rant now. I just wanted to get my thoughts finally out on the news of Naughty Dog clarifying what they're doing with Factions, and I hope for the best in the future. Once again, take care.